Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the third and final discussion in the People Concerns Solving Homelessness panel series. Today, our discussion will focus on the topic of housing solutions. And before we get started, I wanted to share that we have saved room toward the end of the discussion for questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to share your questions. We promise to get through as many of them as possible in our time today. Now, I would like to introduce Michaela Pereira of Good Day LA. We are extremely lucky to have her join us and lead this discussion today. So please welcome Michaela.
Hello. Hi, everybody. And thanks so much, Kate, for what a beautiful introduction. I'm really pleased that I've been invited by the People Concerned to be here with you today as an adopted Angelino. The issue of homelessness and the unhoused in our community is something that concerns me as it does you. It keeps me up at night, as I know it does you. And I'm all about looking for solutions. And so we've gathered a panel today that are solution-minded themselves. I'm really pleased with this stellar panel that has been assembled. I think we're going to tackle some topics that will be helpful to you, right? These topics that are keeping us all up at night. We'll look at the background of why we're in this crisis. We're going to look at what government and service providers can be doing, should be doing, and are doing to help solve the issue. And we'll look at some of the successful models, housing innovations that are being employed to help the most vulnerable among our population. So let's get to the assembled stellar panel that I spoke of, champions for change and thought leaders in this space. By way of introduction, I thought it would be kind of fun and frankly insightful for us and enlightening to hear from each of them. So we asked this question of them before they joined. What keeps them going in the work they do and what keeps them up at night? So Greg Comanor, give us a wave. He was a partner with Daylight Development. What keeps him going is the desire to build supportive housing faster and cheaper. What keeps him up at night, he says, long-term commitment to these programs and to these projects, providing the critical wraparound services that allow our clients to thrive. Greg, so glad you're here. John Maceri, you know that face. Nice to have you with us, of course, the CEO of the People Concerned. And he says, why do I do what I do? Because it's unconscionable that we let people live and die in the streets when we know how to solve this problem. And what keeps him up at night? How to continue to push against the broken systems that create all of the barriers to getting people housed. John, that passion is palpable. So glad you're here. Thank you so much for being part of this. Last but certainly not least, my friend, Jason Ward, who is an associate economist, associate director of RAND Center for Housing and Homelessness in LA. He's a professor, Pardee RAND Graduate School and RAND Corporation. And what he says keeps him going is that what he keeps focused on is the issue as a researcher is just seeing the unhoused Angelinos who are living on the streets every day. It's a daily reminder for him that the ongoing failures of our housing provision and social safety net systems have dire consequences for the lives of tens of thousands of people in the region. Jason, we're so glad to have you as well. All right, gentlemen, are you ready to go? Have you started your engines? Let's talk about this. This is something that is causing so much frustration, but there's a lot of passion behind it as well. So I thought what we could do is hear from each one of you. And John, I'm going to let you go first. Give us a bit of an overview for the uninitiated about the work your organization is doing in this space.
Yeah, I'm happy to. First of all, thank you, Michaela, for being here today, and Jason and Greg for participating as well. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in to listen to us. Just a quick overview. The People Concerned, we're a nonprofit housing and service organization providing services to people experiencing homelessness and victims of domestic violence. And we do that in a variety of ways, beginning with street outreach teams. We're fielding about 18 street outreach teams. We provide interim housing, permanent supportive housing, and then wraparound services. So mental health care, primary care, substance use, and domestic violence services, with the goal of not only getting people housed, but keeping them housed. So we have a 93% retention rate in our permanent supportive housing, and the reason for that is because of the wraparound services. So that's who we are.
And we are so grateful. I know that I am incredibly impressed with the work that the people concerned does and continues to do, and the dedication you all have. Thanks so much for that introduction. All right, Greg, you're next up. Give us a little bit of insight into daylight development.
Great, thanks Michaela, and John, Jason, Kate, Aaron, thanks for having me. I'm a co-founding partner of Daylight Community Development. We founded the company 4 years ago, actually out of UCLA. We were students who were fed up with our homeless crisis, right? We wanted to find ways to get folks inside faster and cheaper. And we were really focused on housing innovation, both from the construction and the financing side. And if you fast forward 4 years, we have over 300 units in construction, 6 projects in construction right now, most of which utilize modular construction to bring those projects in faster and cheaper. And essentially we develop the building and turn it over to John and his team to provide the on-site wraparound services to make sure that those folks are housed and stabilized and thrive in our communities.
I love seeing the partnership. I love seeing innovation coming into it. Greg, I really appreciate you being here. All right, Jason, next up, let's hear from you, from your purview, where you are at and the work you're doing.
Okay, thanks for having me, and I appreciate getting to be here with all of you. So I'm trained as a labor economist, and my connection to housing sort of arose through working on broader topics around the labor market, education and health, and realizing over time how much housing sort of moderates outcomes along all these dimensions and just affects people's lives in a really profound way. The Center on Housing and Homelessness in LA that I co-lead at RAND tries to basically focus on sort of actionable research that can help to improve policymaking in this area. And really, here we're going to talk about the most visible end of this sort of spectrum of housing and homelessness, which is visible homelessness on the streets and trying to help chronically homeless people. But, in Los Angeles, it's also a broader issue of just housing affordability that sort of feeds this ongoing problem of homelessness. So our work has sort of looked at things as diverse as the adaptive reuse and the potential for adaptive reuse of commercial buildings in LA to provide housing with sort of a focus on increasing the stock of affordable housing. I've looked at the effect of restrictive labor agreement added to Proposition HHH by city leaders when it was implemented and how that affected production costs for PSH. And a recent study we've done has conducted a series of enumerations in multiple neighborhoods across LA to look at how the population of unsheltered people fluctuates over time, and also to survey these individuals on their sort of specific housing needs and experiences.
It's kind of amazing when you think about this three-pronged approach that we have of all of you today, right? The data, the physical plant being built, and then the services to wrap all around. This is amazing. John, I actually want to stay with you, and we're going to talk about adaptive reuse a little bit later in this hour, but I think it's important to maybe break down some of the data that you found, break it down for the dummy newscaster. You've had a chance to look at some of the numbers of the rate by which people are falling into homelessness, and the sheer number of people that are unhoused in LA currently. Give us some of the data that you found.
Well, so the last count, that was done, we had about 66,000 people countywide, and we expect the new numbers are coming and will be out, shortly, and we expect those numbers to increase. That's countywide across LA County. Mm-hmm. And I think none of us will be surprised to know that those numbers, we're anticipating that they will go up from 2 years ago. The sad reality is that, and I think this is where all of us working on the front lines every day get very frustrated, because we often hear, as we all hear, well, nothing's being done. And that's just simply not true. I mean, the fact is that there are thousands of people being housed, but the problem is there are more people falling into homelessness every single day than we're housing. So we have not done a good job upstream in terms of preventing people from falling into homelessness. So while we have, 200 people, plus a day being housed, we have 227 people falling into homelessness. So, we're upside down, and we will continue to be upside down until we support the kind of innovation that Greg and his team are doing, and as other developers, try to scale and sustain the number of units that we need. But we have to find a new gear in Los Angeles. I mean, this is not, building at the rate we're building, using the current system at the cost per unit, we are never going to get ahead. We're never going to house the people that we have on the streets currently, and we certainly are not going to be able to house all the new people falling into homelessness. And I think Jason's research, bears that out as well.
Yeah, and Jason, why don't you share a little bit of that research?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the stats that John mentioned are sort of well known. There's so much being done, and I mean, to put it in context, I recently heard about a new federal initiative that was aimed at addressing homelessness. I think it was like $500 million, federally. And I, from the perspective of working on this topic in Los Angeles, I thought $500 million, that's nothing, so I mean, there's so many resources that Angelenos and voters and the state have put toward addressing this issue, but just the staggering scope of the problem. Really, there's no other analogy in the US. When I talk to people about the scope of homelessness here versus other cities where, like, for instance, Houston gets a lot of press for kind of doing a lot of really effective synthesis of their services and outreach to address their problem, but their homelessness, the scope of their chronic homelessness problem is about an order of magnitude smaller than it is in LA. So I think our research points to a lot of barriers. Some of them are sort of structural, some of them are more a matter of bringing resources to bear, and some of them are just a matter of patience, as John alluded to. Like, things are being done, but some of these things take a long time to bear fruit.
The thing that you mentioned that really struck me too, John, and Jason referenced it too, is the idea of the upstream prevention, right? Like that to me is, we could have a whole separate panel on talking about that. So let's talk about, we need to give some hope, right? So solutions do exist, and John, you referenced it as well. And maybe Greg, you can talk a little bit about this from your perspective. There are barriers to success, right? There are barriers to the fact that there are solutions. We know that you talked about the rate by which people are falling into homelessness. You can't keep up with building or creating housing. But what are the other barriers that you're seeing that are preventing people from getting to that affordable housing?
Sure. Thanks, Michaela. And before we move from that last point, I do want to reiterate that Jason and his team at RAND years ago did a study on the preventative care associated with housing folks versus allowing them to stay on the street. And it's cheaper, and it's more effective, and it's more humane to keep those folks housed in a preventative care model. And like it or not, our society, we're not great at preventative care, as we all know. So that's something about putting that upfront investment rather than sort of putting a Band-Aid solution on afterwards. Let's get to barriers, because there are quite a few of them. My favorite stat, someone said this to me recently, and it just sort of creates some real overarching context here, is that the year I was born, there were 30 million Californians. There are now 40 million Californians. So where do you put all those people? It's a simple supply and demand issue, right? There just aren't enough housing units, whether it's permanent supportive housing, whether it's naturally occurring affordable, whether it's large family affordable, or even luxury, right? It is simply a supply issue. So the barriers that we have over 30 years is the lack of investment to make up with that increasing population across Los Angeles and California. We could point to a lot of different barriers over that time, whether it's a lack of investment in transportation, right? So being able to transport into the city and live in places where land and construction costs might be a little bit lower. Zoning codes, right? The entire San Fernando Valley is pretty much zoned for single family, where you can't build multifamily affordable or even market rate housing to build housing units. And the list goes on and on and on. At the end of the day, also, Los Angeles is notoriously difficult to build in, right? There are a lot of overarching codes and permits associated with getting these projects online. We've been working like hell to get all our projects done, and they're moving in a really timely fashion, but it's a difficult process, right? So development alone is not the only solution here. It's one tool in our toolbox, but obviously there are a lot of different things we need to consider, which is what we'll get into: adaptive reuse, purchasing through home key, and other items like that.
And obviously, John, and you can speak to some of these things, there's other factors as well. The political tides, the stigma, even just access to service, even people's own reticence to access service. I mean, you see all sorts of those barriers getting in people's way.
Yeah, I mean, I think Greg has lifted up from a structural standpoint the major obstacles we have in terms of creating more housing. So we're in a deep hole already, or we have this enormous deficit. So we're starting at a disadvantage. But the other side of it is that in some ways, Angelenos are our own worst enemies. The very thing that people complain about, which is having people living on the streets, when you propose a solution, which is to provide housing for them, you'll have neighborhoods show up in mass and say, not in my backyard, I'm not against homeless people, but, do it somewhere else. So we have to own that, that's not, I think most people on this webinar today, but certainly many of our neighbors, across the spectrum have resisted attempts to build housing. So that is certainly a significant barrier. And then the people that we work with every day, we're seeing a population that's aging on the streets as the general population is aging. We're seeing people with much higher levels of disability, both physical, health-wise, struggling with mental health issues, substance use. So you combine all of those things and you have, working with a population that needs pretty easy access in real time to housing and trying to bridge that barrier between moving them indoors to units that are very hard to access at the same time when they are catching them when they are ready and willing to make those changes in their lives.
We talk about the fact that there is progress. There's work being done, as evidenced by the work that all of you are doing and others that are likely on this webinar. But we also know that, as you mentioned, aging population on the streets, the problem is an evolving problem. It's going to require solutions that must also evolve. So let's talk about some of the programs that are in place. John, why don't you start with the government programs that are in place?
Well, I mean, we've seen in terms on the financing side, Measure H and Triple H. So H on the capital side, which Greg and his team and developers have been, Triple H on the capital side, and Measure H on the services side. So to combining, the sort of the best of both worlds, right? To have money, capital money, to be able to acquire and build new housing units, which is critically important. And then on the services side, as I said earlier, it's not just getting people housed, it's keeping them housed. So putting those two together has been a huge boom for Los Angeles. Again, maybe invisible to a lot of people who aren't working day to day, but we're beginning to see many of those projects that have been in the pipelines for years are now in the lease-up phase, and we're starting to see a lot of movement, and that's been a really good thing. I think the downside of that is that the resources aren't large enough. Jason alluded to earlier that, when we start talking about the construction of housing and the long-term services, we're talking about significant investments, and what we don't have is an ongoing dedicated source on the capital side and on the services side that's sufficient enough to meet the demand and to be able to scale. And I think that's been a lot of the frustration is essentially the Triple H dollars are oversubscribed because the projects that were eligible have been funded. And on the H side, we're starting to see now that these units are leasing up, which is a great thing. The dollars that are paying for the services are going to get thinner and thinner as the years go on.
Greg or Jason, let's talk about Project Homekey. Who'd like to jump in on that?
Jason, do you want to go Homekey and I can talk a little bit more HHH?
Sure. Yeah, so I think Project Homekey strikes me as one of the brightest spots in the last just over the period of the pandemic. I mean, that some of my work on adaptive reuse was sort of inspired by seeing what could be done with hotels and motels quite quickly. And I think that Homekey has provided a huge influx of really quick and easily accessible cash. It was all the sort of projects that were being funded with it to do rapid conversion of hotel motels into interim housing and then eventually to permanent supportive housing were aided by some timely legislation that, for instance, created some streamlining and exemption from sort of environmental objections and other things that have been sort of famously used to slow down a lot of infill housing projects in general. And even now, I think as we've, to preview what Greg may have to say, we've seen a lot of high costs from new construction with Prop HHH, which has engendered a lot of sort of, concern. But HomeKey, I think, has shown that in some, in the nearer term, you can kind of quickly acquire existing facilities at reasonable costs and sort of fill a gap that, HHH won't go on to fill for probably a while yet, just due to the slow pace of construction. And, now I think even you see the Housing Authority of Los Angeles using second round HomeKey funds to acquire like new market produced apartment buildings and things of this nature before they're leased up. And so I think it's just been, an extraordinary aid to sort of fill the gap that is left with like long-term new construction plans and so on.
And Greg, you want to talk more about HHH?
Yes. So HHH passed in 2016. The goal of it was 10,000 units by 2028. And the name of the game in affordable housing finance, especially on the new construction side, is the idea of leveraging, right? You'll get one source, you'll leverage that with another source, whether it's tax credits or another program such as HHH. And then once you sort of have the building completed, you'll have a project-based voucher, which will pay the rent for these folks, and then service funding for John and John's team. That's kind of the base structure for these types of projects. The beauty of HHH is that it basically went to the market and said, hey, we need a pipeline of supportive housing developments in the city. So they were the first dollars in to all of these projects, right? So fast forward, obviously only a few of these are done, but there are over 150 supportive housing projects in the pipeline that will all ideally be finished by that 2028 sort of target date to have 10,000 units built and leased up. So we're on track. And I know it's really hard to see it. And obviously HHH was created to build long-term supportive housing, not shelter-based care, not getting folks sort of in an interim housing solution, really for long-term housing first, permanent supportive housing. And that's happening. It's just behind the scenes. And all the while we're seeing folks fall into homelessness.
Well, we talked about the rate by which people are falling into it, right?
Correct.
And we've seen with all of the prices skyrocketing, the economy not rebounding the way they had hoped it would, that rate is speeding up, I would argue, and I think you'd probably all agree. I'm no economist, but will it still be on target?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen costs go up, right? The market is crazy. We have inflation everywhere from the gas pump to buying your bread at the grocery store. Personally,
we drive more people into homelessness, and will it keep you on target with the projects that are in the pipeline for 2028?
Sure. No, there are two different factors at play here, right? It's, can we get these 10,000 units built at a number that's reasonable, that's within our existing resources? And also, what happens to these additional folks that don't have the resources, that fall into homelessness, on a rapid basis? So we're struggling through it, but what I can at least say from our projects is that we're holding our budgets pretty closely, and we're building to a solid number. I mean, it's got a 4 in front of it, not a 6 or a 7 in front of it on a cost per unit basis. The LA Times has an article that came out last week that some projects in Northern California were costing over $1 million to build, and that makes all of our heads explode, right? But thankfully we're not there, and we're all being good custodians of taxpayer dollars to get these units built as fast as possible.
So there's also federal voucher system as well, correct?
Correct. So most of HHH projects are funded through a long-term federal voucher program. So when you think of Section 8, there are two types of Section 8, right? There's the traditional tenant-based that we think of in our culture, right? You give a family a voucher and then they go to a landlord. What our projects are, which is a little bit different, is that voucher is tied to the unit, right? So if a tenant comes and goes, that project will still have operating income coming in to make sure that we can satisfy our debt, we can pay our operating expenses, we can pay for John's staff, like all of the things needed to keep these projects operating. And that's a commitment that really only the federal government can provide. It's a really long-term preventative care source.
Do you have any further thoughts? Because I really am I'm kind of geeking out about the adaptive reuse stuff, and I kind of want to
Do it.
Okay, because what I love about this is, I mentioned before, I love meeting people who are change makers, who see a problem, find a solution. And I love when they add innovation to it. And I think that brings us to this, because with a big problem requires big innovation. So housing innovations in terms of the models that exist now, affordable, permanent supportive housing. I want to turn it over to my man, Jason, because this idea of adaptive reuse, I want you to really kind of dig into that and the success that you're seeing, the data showing that it's successful.
Okay, I'll try to give a 10,000-foot view in a few minutes.
Yes, I know.
Best I
It's
can.
not easy
Yeah,
to do.
so
You
so
got
one
it.
thing one thing that's worth mentioning, I think, for many people may already know this, but LA has a pretty successful history with adaptive reuse, specifically around downtown and the revitalization of a lot of old office buildings and hotel motels, et cetera, down there. So in 2000, the city passed an adaptive reuse ordinance. It may have been passed in '99, but and basically what it did is it streamlined a lot of the procedures required to convert buildings into housing and or hotels in the case of downtown by doing things like, just removing discretionary steps that planners, council members, other people may have, had access to in the past, by sort of like alleviating issues around site plan review and things like that, by specifying alternative building codes that allow easier paths to meet reasonable seismic standards and other standards, and basically sort of breathe new life into the stock of buildings that, ultimately was just going to be a sort of a costly, drag on the city. And over about, I think, less than a decade, downtown LA added about 20% of all the housing units added in Los Angeles, and over a third of these came from adaptive reuse directly. So the city is in the process of trying to revitalize the downtown adaptive reuse ordinance by doing things like allowing even greater flexibility in terms of unit sizes to build very small units, which increases the economies of scale of a lot of these projects, by creating a new stock of buildings, by sort of allowing like a rolling date of buildings to be available rather than like buildings built before 1974 or what have you. So that there's a lot of optimism that downtown can continue to produce housing. I think that the city has other sort of adaptive use related policies. They have they have a motel conversion ordinance that's been on the books for a while, that if you're converting a motel for the use of housing individuals experiencing homelessness, you can streamline a lot of that process. And the city, folks at city planning, to the best of my knowledge, are actively working on coming up with a citywide approach to streamline adaptive reuse in the way that's similar to what was done downtown.
Is there less of NIMBYism when it comes to adaptive reuse? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, conceptually that's a plus, so like if there's an office building sitting with a big for lease sign on and everyone drives by it every day or whatever, if that building suddenly became housing, many people, it wouldn't really, it wouldn't matter much. It's like, there's that building, it's the same building or whatever. And, in some sense, I think a lot of the work to reuse buildings is just a little bit less, obnoxious from a sort of a neighbor perspective. It's stuff that generally happens inside. I think additionally, a lot of commercial properties aren't sort of really in anyone's backyard, so to speak. A lot of commercial properties are sort of clustered together. So to the extent that you're kind of converting commercial properties into housing, it may be that a lot of business owners and adjacent commercial properties are quite happy with that for any number of reasons, right?
And the downtown business associations, you get their support generally for those kinds of projects. Yeah,
for instance, like downtown, sort of civic group folks have been, are very, very behind adaptive reuse downtown, and I think, the more complex story is that the projects are all, they tend to, in general, be complex, right? Each building is some unique thing. And when you start tearing out walls or doing whatever, you may discover a lot of issues that you didn't know about. There may be extensive seismic work that has to be done. There may be a lot of issues to address. There are a number of people working in that space that have a considerable amount of expertise in Los Angeles. But I think also the problem is, in some cases, there's a mismatch between the sort of market price of housing and the market price of commercial real estate, right? In general, for hotels and motels, that price differential is favorable. In other words, the sort of rate for a studio housing unit is quite a bit higher than the rate for a typical economy hotel motel. Mm-hmm. So that suggests that in that sector, there's maybe a lot of leeway to be able to put money into these places, even if you're just going to try to build market rate housing, or, you know, it would be a more affordable way to build, for instance, permanent supportive housing or other sorts of affordable housing. When you get to office space, it's not quite the same story. In a lot of parts of the city, office space prices are quite high, and in some cases they're so high that it's not clear that on its face it's feasible to convert a lot of these properties. I think there are some private developers like Jameson, for instance, who do a lot of work around Koreatown and own a lot of properties there, converting some of their own office buildings into market rate housing. You know, I think in that case, a lot of these people that own the office spaces may be the best people to convert them, because they sort of already have internalized the cost of holding these buildings. So it's really, you know, it's a complicated process, but I think the city can have a really big role to play in just removing barriers and removing sort of cost drivers that can help that play a meaningful role.
And by the way, as we knew, there wouldn't be one solution, one size fits all, but a series of solutions. And that's a piece of it, in addition to the things that Greg and his company and others are doing. So John, Jason, thank you for that. Can we talk about master leasing and maybe define it for those that might be uninitiated?
Sure. So master leasing is essentially, we use it in a couple of ways. It doesn't build new housing units, but what it does do is capture, I'll qualify that in just a minute, because I have a specific example of something we did in a master lease with Greg that actually is creating new units. But so we can look at it in a couple of ways. Essentially, the way we've used it primarily at the People Concern is to go out into the market and work with private landlords and access and secure units under a master lease, where our organization basically provides the full faith and credit of the organization and the monthly rental subsidy to lease the unit, and then we have the right to sublease it. And we generally use those for our clients who have a very hard time accessing housing because of poor work histories, poor credit histories, poor employment histories. And we have found that that's been a very successful way in both creating opportunities and pathways for housing in the existing market. The other benefit is it does create some stabilization in terms of the increased housing costs, because when those units are master leased, they're leased for 5 or 10 years, sometimes longer, and so the rent escalations are contained. So like, for instance, in a high inflationary time like we're seeing now, and rents are going up substantially, a master lease will control that. So it does play a role in affordability. Specific to, you know, what we did in a deal with Greg's company, is we master lease units in a building of new construction, and it sort of provided a piece of the financing that they needed to bring the project home. So essentially, we, you know, they are a private landlord. We committed to leasing those units, and that provided a significant portion of the final money that they needed to get the deal closed. So it can be used in that way. Those are new units. That's a new building that's being constructed. So it could be leveraged on both sides. But you know, I think of it as a strategy really to harness housing that's in the market now, and to also bring in landlords who traditionally wouldn't have been renting to our clients, to give them an opportunity to participate in solving homelessness.
Greg, let's talk new builds, and in terms of what's needed there.
Great. Yeah. So, you know, the traditional construction framework has existed in the same context for 200 years, right? You have folks that are building a podium, and then they're putting wood frame construction on top. And there's the idea, you know, everyone jokes that construction hasn't changed for all this period of time, and costs continue to go up. The raw cost of materials continues to rise, especially in our weird supply chain that we're in right now, due to COVID and other sort of related issues. So what we were hyper focused on is the idea of building through modular construction, and basically assembling the building in sort of, think of Legos that are stacked on top of each other, right? So the reason this makes sense is because, as Jason mentioned earlier, these funds trigger a lot of red tape and increased costs in relating to wages, right? So prevailing wage costs is sort of the term that's tossed around. And it's really not the wages itself, right? So prevailing wages and market wages are both really high. They're paying living wages for construction workers on site. The issue is that in a hot market where a subcontractor can work on a really simple luxury building or a complicated affordable housing project that has 10 times more paperwork, they're going to pick that market rate project every time. So in order to get subs to bid on these projects, there's a premium associated, aside from the cost of labor, there's a premium associated with having a prevailing wage project. So our solution to that was we reached out to a factory in Pueblo, Colorado, lovely manufacturing town in southern Colorado, and they're building our modules on 3 of our projects. So 2 of them have been all delivered. The second project on Van Owen in North Hollywood that John's team will manage, the last boxes come tomorrow, so thank God for that. Yes. But they will basically build the entire building through basically a custom steel frame box. So a 1-bedroom unit will have 2 20 by 12 modules that are trucked on site, craned into place, and basically combined and welded, and we like to say mated. That's the term that we use. They're mated together on site. And obviously this saves cost on the build, but something it really does is if we have less project costs, we have fewer sources, right? So our projects don't have to go wait in line with the limited amount of resources that all of the affordable housing projects across the state are competing against. So it's a way for us to sort of supercharge that pre-development timeline, get these projects moving faster, and get units online faster. So when we think about cost savings, it really is time and money, not just during the construction phase, if that makes sense.
No, it does. You know, one of the things that we have the benefit of doing is talking with people here, right? Obviously, people that care about this issue very deeply. What is your call to action for them? Greg?
I'll go as a voter in Los Angeles. The thing that keeps me up at night, and Michaela, you asked us this when we met before this, is like, what is the big risk to combating homelessness across LA County? And it, like, Measure H is that like amazing tool that we have. It's a sales tax that I don't know what the cent amount is, but it's a tiny sales tax on transactions across the county that funds services for service providers like the people concerned to provide on-site services within our projects, but also street services, right? So that's a 10-year program that's going to sunset in 2025, 2026. And if that goes away, all of these projects are going to be searching for service dollars to pay for that case manager that works out of each building. So, like, if you can do one thing, vote for Measure H at the county level, because that is like the lifeblood of our Housing First Permanent Supportive Housing sort of continuum here in the county.
We're going to open things up to Q&A in a second. I'm going to give our producers, Kate and Aaron, a chance to get those questions to me. But in the meantime, let me put the question to you as well, Jason. What's your call to action to those listening live now, or those that'll listen to the recording later?
So I echo all the things that Greg mentioned, but the one thing I think is sort of additional, that's a little bit more of a big picture idea, and it goes to your point that, you know, people with inflation and other economic situations developing now, you know, many more people will probably fall into homelessness, which is happening all the time. And I think that, you know, these solutions tend to be focused on people who've been homeless for long periods of time, have developed a lot of needs related to that experience in many cases, right? But I think one thing that needs at least as much attention is just trying to make housing production and housing costs a lot more effective in the region, right? We need a lot more housing in general for just the quality of life of all Angelenos, you know. And I think that, so you know, supporting streamlining of housing production, supporting, you know, changes that allow for a lot more multifamily housing, even at market rates, you know, and those sorts of things. I think those kinds of policies are the kinds of things that don't register as important. And maybe people think, I don't want a big apartment complex next to me. You know, I currently have one being built right across the street from me. We're a single family home was. It's going to become 15 studio apartments. I don't love that I'm going to lose some of my view, but I think it's exactly what needs to be happening in LA. And so I think that, you know, just keeping that eye on the bigger picture of like livability in the region, that has a lot to do with just housing production writ large. And so I think, you know, being open to pragmatic solutions by policymakers, especially policymakers who will step out and put their necks on the line for things is important.
John, I'm going to get you to hold. You'll actually end our session with the answer to your question, given that you're the CEO, the people concerned, because I don't want to be accused of fake news. So I'm going to go to we promised, some of the questions that have been sent in. And Greg, fresh off the press, question number 1, what is a reasonable number that we should expect housing cost per unit? How can we share this on a larger scale?
This is the big question of the day. So I would say, and maybe this is an unpopular take, but the reason why people complain about affordable housing cost per unit is because they're public, right? So the cost of luxury housing is just as expensive in a lot of cases, but those are private numbers that people aren't talking about. In a perfect world, I mean, the average HHH cost per unit is somewhere in the mid 500,000 per unit, I think. That's obviously changing. Jason, thank you for the affirmation, because that was pulled out of thin air. But that's changing, obviously, in an inflationary environment. But the important thing, and the city points to this a lot, is the city through HHH is only funding approximately 140,000 of each of those units. So you're leveraging other sources federally, statewide, in order to get those projects to pencil and for the buildings to be built. Thankfully, we're a little bit below that. Obviously, they're not done yet. We're in the mid 400s per unit. But obviously, that's the average. There are different reasons why a project cost would go up. If you have to replace a public parking, there's sort of different site parameters that would drive costs up or down in either direction. But that's kind of the average number right now.
John, with the voucher being attached to a unit, how does that impact individuals if there's movement in and out?
Well, that's a great question. So as Greg said earlier, there's two kinds of voucher subsidies, tenant-based and project-based. And from a development standpoint, project-based subsidies are more desirable for a couple of reasons. One, on the front end, they help with underwriting the deal, because any lender is going to look at what is the long-term cash flow on the project to be able to manage and service the debt and manage the building over a long period of time. The flip side of that is that when someone has a tenant-based voucher, if they move, that subsidy goes with them. So there have been a lot of investments at the federal level on tenant-based vouchers, because it creates more choice for people. And so I think for me, it's not an either or. Either you have tenant-based or project-based. You need both. We need a substantial amount of project-based subsidies, because if we want to scale the production of housing, those developers are going to need those project-based vouchers, those subsidies, to be able to make the projects work. And also, when we've seen almost 7,000 what are called emergency housing vouchers, all of which are tenant-based, that have been put into Los Angeles in the last year and a half, and we're seeing the impact of giving people flexibility in terms of taking those rental subsidies and moving anywhere they want to in the county, as long as they can find an available unit. So, it's not, for me, it's not either or, it's and both.
It's and both. Jason, question for you that came in. Should HHH be renewed by voters?
Well, HHH was a one-time project, so it would take another KKK or JJJ. Sorry for the terror. That was a terrible. We'll never call a proposition that, hopefully. But it would be a starting from scratch thing. I mean, whether you're going to be able to convince voters to put up that much money again is an open question. I think that there are legitimate criticisms of the way things have gone with HHH. However, I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that when completed, the additional PSH created by that funding source will represent a dramatic increase in the stock in the entire county. So I mean, I guess I would say that depends on the extent to which lessons are learned. I think a lot of the innovative approaches that Greg and others have taken provide good lessons. I think that some of the research I've done that sort of looks at how hard it is to mash up a lot of different goals with housing production. If you want to also involve your environmental goals and labor goals and all these other things, then it gets expensive, and so you're sort of pricing all these other social goals into the production of permanent supportive housing. I think that's just a debate that needs to be had transparently in the public, so that people know what they're really kind of voting for, and then they're not surprised that we're kind of paying for a lot of things. We're not just paying for a sort of a generic unit of housing, and then they can make an informed decision about that.
Can I jump into this one?
Of course, Greg, please.
So HHH was a capital source, as John mentioned, right? It was to pay for the bricks and mortar of the building. Theoretically, we could re-envision, if we were to invest in new construction of supportive housing, we could re-envision how we would approach an investment. I've looked at what it would look like if, rather than paying for the bricks and mortar, if there was a larger voucher program funded by a bond measure like HHH, right? And that way you'd leverage the private market, a bank that could provide a construction loan, an insurance company that could provide equity, and you'd have more of a traditional market rate capital stack. You would just be paying the rent, not from a family that is earning $120,000 to $150,000 a year, but through a voucher program that's funded publicly. So it'd be a different flavor, I would say a more efficient flavor, to build housing at scale with public support.
Question for John, and forgive if I am mispronouncing this or missaying this. For those receiving LACDA's assistance, why doesn't the voucher value increase yearly, especially given the extreme difficulty with rising rental costs in a market that doesn't want to rent to us?
That's a great question, and I would say that's one of the areas of advocacy that we need to. The voucher payment standards should increase, based on what the market conditions are, because I know that's very frustrating, and we're experiencing it on our master leases, and I know all of our development partners are struggling with increased operating costs, and yet they don't see the rate of those rental subsidies increasing. So I think that's something that on a federal level we absolutely need to advocate for and get the local housing authorities to have fidelity to these units that are going to be essentially restricted for decades, to be able to compensate the developers or the owners of those properties for escalating costs.
And that is happening at the city level. The voucher standard is increasing through the city housing authority.
Before we get too far away from the HHH conversation, Jason, maybe you don't mind answering this one if you feel comfortable. This question points to, it says basically, how can we promote continued support of Measure H when there are still so many people living on sidewalks? I have a sense that political will is waning for investing in homelessness because people are not seeing the impacts.
So I'm assuming you're talking about H. You said Measure H, but I think that's
Measure
probably
H,
right. Yeah.
Measure H, pardon me.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's really a challenge, and I think that it's hard to dismiss the concerns of people that say, I voted to raise a lot of money 6 years ago. Why does everything look the same as or worse? But again, I get back to that point of I think at a certain point you'll see these dollars pay off, and I think at a certain point there are a lot of really useful lessons to be learned. I think this is something Greg was sort of alluding to. To me, there are a lot of creative things you could do. You could create another large source of funding that paid the entire bill for building projects really rapidly, right? And then you wouldn't have to sit around and wait 2 years to get low-income housing tax credits and put together 3 other bonds, sources and all these sorts of things. You could create a renewable funding source that could probably save a lot of money. I think that the kind of acquisitions that have been happening of market-produced buildings and hotel motels and other things like that could be ways. There are a lot of ways that you could come up with that same amount of money again and potentially do a lot better. That may be hard to sell to voters, but that may also depend on when you start seeing some real concrete progress from the money that's already been spent.
Greg, what's the most important thing city and county government could do to make building supportive housing easier?
Permits and entitlements, right? We need to improve the way that these projects are vested from an entitlement standpoint. Everyone knows we need affordable housing, and yet, theoretically, a zone change can take 1.5 years and use resources of public servants. So we need to find a way to create an emergency program for allowing sites to be used as affordable housing immediately.
John, a question for you, and I'm reading verbatim here, but I think it'll make sense. What is a realistic timeline for this? The person goes on to say, how do we work to help people now and then have them ready for the different options?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the push and pull that I hear, because I hear this all the time, of course, that there is a crisis on our streets that is getting worse and not getting better. And so I think it's very hard for most Angelenos to say, well, we're having these conversations about building $500,000, dollars a unit, up to $1 million, whatever it is, and yet we see human suffering on the street, every day. So why should we do this when we should just, put up huge tents, force everybody to move into them, clean up the streets, and we're kind of done? And my response to that is, again, from a policy, and I always look at everything from a systems and a policy perspective. As a service provider, we deal with one individual, one human life at a time, but our work is not going to get any easier until the systems that we're laboring under and the policies we're laboring under change and are more favorable to the people we're trying to serve. So again, this is not an either or conversation, it's and both. I think we absolutely have an obligation to alleviate human suffering, immediate human suffering, and we do that by providing temporary interim housing that is available to people in real time in ways that they can access. And we also need to accelerate the production of permanent solutions, because at the end of the day, as happy as people might be about that encampment not being on the street and those folks moved into a tent, they're still homeless in a tent. And so long term, the money that we're spending on all of these temporary interventions far exceeds both the resources that we have available and will not permanently house those folks, and we'll be spending infinitely more money, which is not sustainable or scalable. We've been fortunate in the last couple of years, with COVID relief funds, that there's been a huge infusion of federal dollars, one-time federal dollars, which are drying up. And fortunately, the state has had a significant surplus the last 2 years. That will not sustain over the long haul. So, we need to absolutely work harder on creating immediate solutions that we can move people off the streets into some kind of temporary housing. And at the same time, we need to also be asking ourselves the question, and then what? Because if we're not investing on the back end, we're going to end up with a system, that cannot be paid for over a long period of time. And most of those people are going to end up returning to the streets. And then people are going to be really, really upset.
Right, and that's part of the problem, right? The now and the long term, and the fact that it's, in a way, you're drinking from a fire hose, right? This problem, instead of stemming the tide, it seems to be opening the tap up even more. So this feels like a question that all of us would ask. How do we utilize these innovations that are here at our disposal? What do we as community members, as educators, as elected officials, service and community providers need to know and to ensure that all of our neighbors can be housed and healthy and safe? That talk about a big thought. Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I'll go first. First of all, I want to underscore that, what Jason and Greg lifted up in terms of things we need to be focusing on. And, I think that, at the end of the day, one of the things that's most frustrating as a service provider, and I have such respect, for Greg and his team, when we talk about innovation, one of the things that we don't do well as a system, and I think, as a community here in Los Angeles, is we don't really support and fund innovation and sort of let the creativity and the entrepreneurship of folks who have actually good ideas and better ideas that could build faster and cheaper, and really support them in those efforts. So that would be my, call to action, is that, what we often see happen is these public funding sources get involved and they essentially beat any form of innovation out of the innovators, because, they're constantly, putting a square peg in a round hole. And I really think that, you look at the research that Jason's done, there's been plenty, of evidence-based practices around, the country about the positive effects of permanent supportive housing. And we also know that the current financing system creates, in and of itself, it's not bad people doing bad things, it's good people trying to do good things in a very broken system. And so creating alternatives in the private capital market, the ideas that Greg has, there's social impact investing that could be structured in different ways, separate from the low-income tax credit financing world that everyone is laboring under now, that would really unleash access to capital, large amounts of private capital, that you could actually build housing faster and cheaper and get per unit costs down to, a third of the time and a third of the the cost that we're currently producing. That can be done. I mean, I think that's what's so frustrating for those of us who are practitioners is we know it can be done. It's all the obstacles and barriers on the systems side that really prevent us from doing that. And so my hope is that we will see, on a go forward basis, some shifts in policy and the policy makers that really embrace and support real innovation, not trying to sort of mold everyone around to the current way of doing things, because the current way of doing things is not going to get us to scale or sustainability.
We're drawing to the end of our time together. I want to ask a quick question of each, Greg and Jason, and I'm going to final word to our CEO of the people concerned. I wonder, given all the data that you look at on the regular, Jason, do you still remain hopeful that we can get our arms around this?
It's very daunting, I will say. I mean, I think that we'll see what happens when the numbers come out from this year's annual point in time count, which was delayed, which was basically not done in 2021. I think there's some evidence that in some areas, numbers of unsheltered people have decreased. We're seeing some evidence that that's not across the board. We've seen some increases in our own research, but I think that the high cost of housing overall in LA is just a huge challenge. Like everyone who lives in a $2 million home that used to be a $1.3 million home has no interest in seeing that become a $1.3 million home again, or an $800,000 home, though that would kind of be the best thing for a broad affordability crisis, right? But it's just we're sort of stuck in a really high cost environment. I think that moving with purpose and reasonable progress towards expanding the housing supply enough to just flatten that kind of growth in housing prices so that it becomes more of an important part of your life and not a sort of investment good per se is probably the best we can do. And, that would be a big improvement. If we just get the costs of housing to sort of moderate, then I think we can start getting a grip on what we have to do to deal with all the very salient fallout that we see in terms of unsheltered people living on the streets.
And Greg, you're working in it, you're in the front line, you're in the trenches, you're building and you're building. Do you feel hopeful?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously it's a challenging problem. It's a challenging place to build, but the city and the county and the state to that fact have made giant investments in affordable housing. I kind of reiterate to where we started earlier is that the federal government needs to match that investment, right? This is a giant problem that can only be solved with real large scale solutions. And HHH is fantastic, but if the feds aren't going to match that investment, it really makes it a challenge. And it's a generational fight that's going to take 20 years, right? From a housing affordability context across all of these different types of housing that we need. So stay engaged. I mean, I know that the last couple of days have been a challenge for, really horrible news across the feds on other subjects, but like we have to remain engaged and hopeful and hope in the dark, right? We have to continue to engage as we make sure that the feds match the needs that we have locally to get folks inside.
To that end, the other day, Gloria Steinem was quoted as saying she's a hopeaholic. And that's the space that I'm going to stay in. John, let's end with you. I know you are hopeful. I've had a chance to speak with you before, separate from this. But what is your call to action to the people that are tuned in today and listening? We can be a part of this solution ourselves.
Yeah, we can. And first of all, thank you again, Michaela, Jason, and Greg for engaging in this conversation, for everybody who's listening. I am hopeful. I mean, I don't think you can do this work without either having a genetic defect or being hopelessly optimistic. And I think this is a problem that is solvable. It is daunting. The numbers are large. My call to action, besides what I said earlier, is that I do think that as a community we need to continue to push our elected officials and the policymakers to move in the direction that is going to create innovation in real ways, support innovation, relax bureaucratic obstacles, because there's a lot that can be done on the local level in terms of land use and permitting and just moving things through, and to act with some sense of urgency. We're in a crisis. I think one of the things that's most frustrating is that we hear all this hand wringing and when the TV cameras are rolling, about how, what a humanitarian crisis it is. But by and large, most of our policymakers don't behave as if we are in a crisis. And I think that's very frustrating. I can tell you those of us on the front lines have a sense of urgency and feel like we're in a war zone every single day. And I would like to see, the same thing on the policy side. And I think that will come. And I've said this always about this issue, when there's a massive political will, and not being angry at homeless people or wanting to punish homeless people, but when there is collective moral outrage, and in my view, that's what there should be, is a collective moral outrage that we let people, continue to live and die on the streets when we know how to solve this problem, and the political will, to get it done. Going back to Project Home Key is a good example of, we saw when you marshal resources, we had more people moved inside in Project Room Key sites and under 60 days than we had ever seen any kind of mobilization before in the history of Los Angeles in doing this work. So it can be done when there are resources and when there's political will and there's a sense of urgency.
I am infinitely grateful that all of you put on your flak jackets and stand in the battle lines. I think about the moral obligation we have to care for our neighbors. It sickens me, it frustrates me, it infuriates me. It's what led me to be here today, because this is what I can do, use my voice to help facilitate conversations that I hope will inspire others, to inform others, to help call others to action. Our sincerest thanks, Jason Ward, Greg Comanor, and John Maceri. Thanks so much for your insight, your wisdom, your humor, your warmth, your intelligence, and most of all, your passion for what you do. And hopefully those of you at home have had a further fire ignited in you to make sure that we keep pushing for solutions, and hopefully we'll be able to have further conversations. Thank you all, and thanks to Kate and Aaron for facilitating this conversation today. I'm Michaela Pereira. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.